Hello and welcome to Doc Review with me, Camelia Shambayati. In this episode, we'll be reviewing American Anarchist, directed by Charlie Siskel. And joining us today, we have Carol Allen, who has written and broadcast about film for The Times, New Woman, BBC Radio, and many others. She writes currently for CloseUpFilm.com, Movies One, and is editor and film critic for AEA Digest. And beside her is John Rees, who is a writer, broadcaster, and activist, and is one of the organisers of the People's Assembly. His books include The Algebra of Revolution, Imperialism and Resistance, Timelines, A Political History of the Modern World, and many more. Now, in American Anarchist, director Charlie Siskel confronts the now late infamous author William Powell on the impact of his controversial book, The Anarchist Cookbook, which since its release in 1971 has been linked with decades of violent anti-government attacks, school shootings, and domestic terrorism. American Anarchist tells a cautionary tale of youthful rebellion and unforeseen consequences. Let's have a look at our first clip.
You know, we talk about the cliche of the skeleton in the closet. Well, my skeleton's not in the closet. My skeleton is in print, and I live with that.
The Anarchist Cookbook.
The Anarchist Cookbook.
The Anarchist Cookbook.
A do-it-yourself bomb-making manual.
When I was 19, I was angry. I thought the government was out of control. We were going to move from irresponsible power in the hands of old white men and put it into the common domain. I mean, whose hands should it be in?
So many bombings in the 70s, and we would frequently find the Anarchist Cookbook at the bomber's house.
I really kind of reclused myself. I didn't want to know. The last thing I wanted to know was that it had been used in some sort of escapade that had ended up hurting people.
When was the first time you learned of a connection between an act of violence and the book?
It was Columbine. I had no idea. Why would I make the connection?
You had written a book about it, an instructional book.
I'm getting the impression that you want me to say something I'm not saying.
Do you feel responsible?
If you're asking, do I wish I had done more? Yes.
Welcome both of you to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on. Carol, if I can start off with you, what's your take on this documentary?
I was just thinking, actually, the trailer sells the film rather strongly, doesn't it? Picking out all the sexy bits, as it were. It's not a bad documentary. The interest, of course, is not on the pretty pictures, so it's perfectly okay to watch this on a computer, whereas normally I don't like watching films on a computer or something. But the interest is, of course, William Powell himself, and I think he comes over rather well. I rather liked him, I'm afraid. Well, no, because we'll be going into what he actually says about the book later on. As far as putting it in context is concerned, there's quite a lot of context, visual context, in terms of archive stuff, particularly of the counterculture at the beginning.
John, what do you think? What's your take on this film?
Well, I think it's a compelling watch. I watched it, right through to the end with considerable interest. I've got no sympathy for either for anarchist terrorists or anarchist terrorists, so it wasn't that was holding me, certainly. But I do think that the director chose to get the interview that he wanted, to build the film around that, and so you've got a kind of linear form of argument. Man writes book says bad things happen. And that decontextualizes the events that it then goes on to talk about, whether it's the original events around William Powell's life in the late 60s and early 70s, or the use of the book later, or then the use of the book supposedly much, much later in the 1990s and 2000s. So I think there's a lot missing if you wanted to really understand properly whether or not and how this book had any impact.
And what's fascinating about this documentary is the disconnect we see between Powell and the legacy of his work. He claims in the film that he wrote the book and wasn't sure that people would follow it. Do you believe this claim, Carol?
He was 19. We were all a bit mad when we were 19, I think. Yes, I mean, there he was, a 19-year-old member of the counterculture, and he'd had a somewhat disruptive childhood. He was a bit of an angry young man, as we used to call the people of that time. And he then went on to train as a teacher and to teach challenged, difficult children in various poor parts of the world. Half the time, he didn't really know what was going on with his book. I think he'd almost forgotten about it.
Well, we're going to touch more, actually, about the book in the next part. As we take a look now at our next clip from American Anarchist, where we see author William Powell read excerpts from the Anarchist Cookbook.
Keep in mind that the topics written about here are illegal and constitute a threat. Also, more importantly, almost all the recipes are dangerous. This book is not for children or morons. It's true. It's not a book for children, and it's not a book for morons.
The book is published in 1970. You were equipping people with this knowledge to do what?
Yeah, I don't think that... I hoped they would do anything with it, quite frankly. This is a book for anarchists, those who feel able to discipline themselves on all the subjects from drugs to weapons to explosives. I don't think the book actually says, this is what you should do with this information. In fact, it doesn't. A freedom fighter can never surrender, for if he does, he becomes part of the problem. There is no trial in times of trouble, just torture and death. It's not, let's go and burn the government down. That's not there. The only laws an individual can truly respect and obey are those he instills in himself. And there is only one choice for a real man, and that is revolution. This country with its institutions belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whenever they shall grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it, or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it.
So what were you advocating?
I think I was advocating people to think for themselves.
John, as Carol pointed out earlier, Powell was only 19 years old when he wrote this book, and in the film it says that this was a time in the US of a lot of political unrest, and there was anger over the Vietnam War, and Powell said that change needed to happen. So given this tense political atmosphere, was Powell justified in writing this book?
I don't know if justification's the issue. I think explanation is the issue, and they're two separate things. And what I think the film, one of the ways I think the film doesn't do as much as it should do, is to provide the context. You said the film provides context, but it doesn't. Powell is the only voice telling you what happened in the 60s, plus raw footage. So there's no directorial voice explaining the context, and the context is weak. You aren't told, for instance, that in the timescale that he was writing and the book was published, you have the Kent State Massacre, where the federal authorities in the United States gunned down 4 students on a campus. You aren't told that during this timescale, 28 members of the Black Panther Party were assassinated by the US state in a 2-year period. Now, this is a very, very violent time in American politics, numerous urban riots. So it's not surprising that an impressionable 19-year-old, and we only learn quite what a disturbed and difficult childhood he had later in the film, immersed in this, might write something like this, however ill-advised that is. So that's one of the points, I think, where the film doesn't provide the context that you would need in order to seriously understand what was likely to be going on in that 19-year-old's mind when they sit down with their typewriter.
Carol, would you agree with that? And do you think this decision by the director was made intentionally, not to provide too much context?
Yes, I think the director had a sort of agenda in his mind. I'm going to make this man responsible for virtually every terrorist or act that has happened since 1971 or whenever it was that the book was published. Powell admits some responsibility for what people have done with his book quite early on in the film. And the fact that Siskel keeps on and on and on asking the same question, and it must be, I think, towards the end, isn't it, John, where Powell says, look, Charlie, I think there's something you're trying to get, you want me to tell. It came up in the trailer there, and I don't know what it was. And we don't know what it was. We think, well, you've had your answer, Charlie. This man agreed to do the interview. He's actually explained quite a lot. And he's not responsible for every terrorist act, as he points out quite rightly. OK, I'm responsible. I wrote the book. I was 19 years old. There are things I put in it which I think are really daft. I mean, there was one quote, oh, can I find it, about respect must be earned by the spilling of blood. Well, he says, that was really cool when I was 19, and it's pretty damn daft now, isn't it?
Well, perhaps in Powell's defense, he said in the film that he collected a lot of the information that's in the book from public military manuals.
Exactly.
So is it fair, John, to then blame Powell for all the subsequent related crimes that have taken place?
I certainly think this is the point about contextualizing things. You would also have to say, I think with a fair degree of certainty, that the people who committed those later terrorist attacks, if they hadn't got it here, they would have got it from somewhere else, because it's certainly not the only place where you can learn this kind of material. And then you have to ask the question, well, simply because the perpetrators of these acts have the Anarchist Cookbook among their library, was it directly responsible? I mean, Columbine is made, there's a huge fuss made of Columbine in the film. But in actual fact...
It's interesting that you raised that point. It's a really good point, as we're going to talk about Columbine in the next part, actually. So let's now take a look at another clip from the documentary American Anarchist, which shows the connection between the Columbine High School massacre and the Anarchist Cookbook, in which 12 students and 1 teacher were brutally killed and 21 injured by the 2 students of the school in 1999.
How did you learn that the book was associated with Columbine?
I got an email from a friend in the United States who'd seen the film Bowling for Columbine and had seen the book in the film.
The thing is I have a thing, it's called the Anarchist Cookbook. It shows you how to make bombs and stuff like that in it. If there's anything that went wrong, they're going to come to me first.
Just because you owned a copy of the book?
Just because I own a copy.
Never made a bomb yourself?
Nope. Oh, as in like, oh, I've made them.
I imagine you had some kind of visceral reaction.
Yeah, I mean, you feel terrible. You feel sick to your stomach, and
was your instinct to try to learn more?
There was part of me that didn't want to know anything about it, and there was part of me that was torn apart about it that did want to learn more.
At this point, we're in the internet age. Everyone Googles themselves, and you have a book that you can search. At any point, did you start to look at whether the book was connected to any other events?
I did do a Google search of the Anarchist Cookbook, and there was hundreds and hundreds of entries. But I didn't spend a whole lot of time going through them.
Now, we touched briefly on this subject before in previous discussion. It's an interesting subject. Do you think the Anarchist Cookbook, then, John, is more of a symptom of the problem of violence in the US rather than the actual cause?
Yes, and I don't even know how far you could push it to say that it's a symptom of it. I mean, with Columbine, the killings weren't done by bombs. They tried to plant bombs, but they didn't go off. So if they got it from the Anarchist Cookbook, either it's not a very good cookbook, or, as he suggests at one point, they are morons. That, the link there is tenuous. What actually did the killing in Columbine was shotguns and machine pistols. So if we want to discuss what might be the cause of Columbine, we should start off with the gun culture in the United States. Lots of the discussion around Columbine talked about the kids being on drugs, talked about their alienation, talked about violent gaming. So it's again a question where you isolate one factor, which may have been a small element, but we aren't told
a
what.
loose connection, if you will.
And we might not even know what else. What other books did these guys have? I mean, we all know that there's often in the press these days said to be a very strong connection between having, on the religious right, the Bible, or the Quran. We know these are malfunctioning explanations for a much more complex picture, and I think we have to apply the same kind of analytical rigor with something like this, and I don't think the documentary does that.
And Carol, so John's saying there that Powell shouldn't take the brunt of the blame when it comes to these related acts of violence. Do you think that Powell should have made more of an effort to speak out against his cookbook then?
He did. I think he wrote something in The Guardian at one point, and he put a statement on Amazon. I mean, bear in mind, half the time he was way out of the news media loop and had no idea this was going on. You raised the subject of the American gun culture there. I think that's an understandable but significant omission from this film because it's made by Americans. Also, all the incidents referred to where, and they were reading the Anarchist Cookbook, doesn't mention any of the ones in Europe, or Australia, or Bali, or the East, or anywhere else in the world apart from America. I wonder how many of those people were reading the Anarchist Cookbook, or did they, nowadays, they just look it all up on the internet. I'm sure they can find recipes. And we don't look very much at the responsibility of the publisher of the book, who bought Powell out years and years ago. So Powell has no control over the book anymore. I checked last night. It's still way up on Amazon. I'm sure you can get it in all sorts of other places. Also interesting is the number of rip-off books there are. There's other Amazon cookbooks. There's one, I think it's a little bit of, like left-wing, or whatever you like to call it, revolutionary chat, and vegan recipes. Now, I wonder, is some moron, as the gentleman puts it, going to buy that book and try and make a bomb with lentils? It would be
That's
great
a very
fun,
funny point that you make. And actually, we're going to talk about the availability of the book still online today, as we take a look at our final clip from American Anarchist, which shows how the cookbook is still in circulation, and examples of people testing out some of the recipes and posting the videos online.
This is the Anarchist Cookbook. I got this from Amazon.
As you can see before you, the Anarchist Cookbook. The information in the book is really good information. It's usable. It's practical. They show you how to do this shit.
Somewhere along the line, they appropriated William Powell's original title.
You can find things online that call themselves some version of the Anarchist Cookbook. Oh my God!
This is not just a cookbook. This is a book of ideas.
Hey guys, today we're going to be playing some more Super Columbine Massacre. The boys downloaded a page from the Anarchist Cookbook.
It was clear to me there had been a resurgence of interest, so I put out a statement through Amazon. I have recently been made aware of several websites that focus on the Anarchist Cookbook. The central idea of the book was that violence is an acceptable means to bring about political change. I no longer agree with this. I want to state categorically that I am not in agreement with the contents of the Anarchist Cookbook. I consider it to be a misguided and potentially dangerous publication which should be taken out of print.
John, can you believe that this book is still available to buy online?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. I think it would be, even if you thought it was desirable, it would be very difficult to suppress. Text is in the modern world, to be honest, always has been. And this is why I don't really buy the argument that if he'd said more, I mean, perhaps he should have said more, but I don't think that if he had said more, it would have led to the suppression of the book or to people not reading the book. I just don't think that's possible.
I think Powell made an effort, though, to make sure because he sold the rights to the publisher and he had no control in putting it back. So he did try, but I don't think he was able to.
And I don't think even if he'd been more forceful in that, it would have led to less people reading the book. I just think it's one of those publications that suddenly hits a particular nerve for reasons completely outside the author's control, and then it kind of takes on a life of its own. Books do take on a life of their own. And
but shouldn't it be made illegal? I think it is in Australia.
I think that's I think that would be an adverse move in terms of censorship anyway. When you start making one book illegal, it's very easy to then make another and another and another illegal. So, and because I don't think there is any direct causal connection between reading this book and doing these things. I mean, it seems that there must be, because there's technical information about how to do it. But actually, that's not the problem. The problem is, why do people decide to carry out murderous acts? Once they've made that decision, they will always be able to find the means. As we know, these days, all you've got to do is hijack a truck and drive it down the front of Nice, and you can cause more damage than any of those bombs or even the killings that Columbine did. So just because it's technical and it looks as if there to almost be a cause and effect, is not necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing to understand is, how do people get to such a state of mind that they carry out these acts? What is the political, economic, social, psychological context that gets a person to that point?
And Carol, would you agree with what John just said?
I was just thinking, I agree with every word, actually. I don't really have anything to add to that, except Powell does raise the point towards the end of the film that is violence an inevitable part of the human condition? And I rather suspect it is, and that's really the point, rather than whether there's a book giving you instructions on how to make a bomb.
And what do you think the final message of this documentary is?
Whoa.
I mean, are the viewers made to cast judgment on Powell? Do we, by the end of the film, sympathise for him?
I sympathise for him. I get irritated with Charlie Siskel for casting judgment on it. And also, on a technical point, I do wish Charlie had had a higher level mic, because I couldn't always hear his questions.
And what did you make of this overall, John?
I think the intended punchline comes right at the end when they're discussing his second book, which is a historical fiction about the character that assassinated Archduke Ferdinand and therefore triggered the First World War, allegedly. And they talk about the butterfly effect, the famous so-called theory that if a butterfly flaps its wings on this side of the world, some huge consequence happens on the other side of the world. But that actually is a misunderstanding of what that theory says. What that theory says is that when other huge causes are in play, then a relatively small change somewhere else can trigger bigger things. And that misunderstanding tells you everything you need to know about this film. It believes that if the butterfly flaps its wings, William Powell writes this book when he's 19, this has this huge rippling cause for a decade afterwards. What it misses out is that it's got the theory wrong. The theory is that there are bigger causes in play, and then a small flapping of the wings can change things. So what we need to look at is, what are the big causes? Because it isn't true that every time a butterfly flaps its wings, something big happens.
That's a very deep point to leave it on, but thanks very much, John and Carol, for joining the show. It was a pleasure to have you on. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this episode of Doc Review. Thanks for tuning in, and make sure you follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find us on @DocReviewShow. Do let us know your views on today's film, and you can even suggest a documentary that you would like us to review. I've been Camelia Shambayati, and see you on the next episode of Doc Review.